Animating Rebel's response to me on idealism is pointless because he knows I wasn't arguing against his made-up version of idealism in my videos. When my series was written, Animating Rebel and IP were still busy coming up with their positions. So a lot of it is just vague fuckery involving him making up his own definition of mind. There is one thing I need to address though. He lies about the argument he uses for idealism. He says I misrepresented his argument, and that his actual argument is that we cannot possibly make sense of matter without taking into account phenomenal properties, but since phenomenal properties don't exist sans observation, we can't even make sense of what matter is supposed to be, apart from some noumena having spatial extension. But as we can clearly see, Animating Rebel previously argued that since matter is supposed to exist beyond our perceptions, it cannot be conceived of, cannot be coherently defined, has no shape or form, does not change, is not located in space, has no property that can be experienced, and is indistinguishable from nothing. So my parody of Animating Rebel's insane argument was accurate. He is literally saying that since matter is outside of perception, it has no observable properties and does not exist. The problem with his argument is that his conclusion does not follow. The fact that you're not looking at what you're not looking at, which is a tautology, doesn't entail that the thing you're not looking at has lost its potential to be observed and has ceased to exist. It just means you're not fucking looking at it. Next, Animating Rebel says that matter is vague and meaningless. First of all, having spatial extension is not vague or meaningless. And secondly, things outside of our perception don't just have spatial extension. They still have a very long list of properties. Spatial extension is just that which distinguishes a material thing from an immaterial thing. First, Animating Rebel fails to understand two important arguments. The arguments that you cannot choose your thoughts or desires. He says that everyone already accepts these conclusions, and that they have no consequences for free will. Of course, these arguments are relevant to free will as many people understand it. It's not uncommon for a person to think that their choices are based on their desires. That is, they do what they want to do. But if they have no control over what they want, then obviously their responsibility is reduced. As for not being able to choose your thoughts, again, it is completely obvious where this argument is going. If you think your thoughts have any influence on your choices, then it shouldn't be that hard to understand why not being able to choose your thoughts would be a problem for responsibility. These arguments are also relevant to Animating Rebel's model of free will, because his model is that a choice is just a coin toss that determines which of your desires you're going to act on. So your only options are to act on your desires, and you don't get to choose those desires. Next, he addresses the argument from the Libet experiment. That's not an argument I use, so I'm going to skip that part. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be reading his quotes and responding to them. He complains that no explanation is given as to how an indeterministic event can be caused by choice, but I don't see why this is at all problematic. After all, self-determination and being able to choose otherwise are very intuitive concepts, and they are starting points that are innocent until proven guilty. Animating Rebel, you are clearly shifting the burden of proof. That's not how this works. Go fuck yourself. He then says that randomness doesn't support free will at all. Anders' argument here completely leaves out the fact that randomness is not something that one can take to be a serious alternative to self-determination, which is something we all intuitively recognize, as opposed to the highly counterintuitive claim of randomness. Randomness is guilty until proven innocent, while self-determination is innocent until proven guilty. These are just assertions. Philosophers and physicists take randomness seriously all the time. Why isn't randomness a serious alternative? Animating Rebel doesn't explain this anywhere in the blog post, but I'm aware that he once made up his own incoherent argument against randomness. It's just gibberish. No one can make sense of what he's trying to say. And free will isn't more plausible than randomness. There is an actual argument against free will, and we can tell it's effective because it has forced Animating Rebel to come up with various insane explanations until he finally arrived at his coin toss model, which is, guess what? A random choice. Randomness isn't an alternative to Animating Rebel's free will. Randomness is Animating Rebel's model of free will. Ander then employs ad hominem attacks on the authors of a different paper supporting free will. He doesn't bother arguing against these papers, He merely attacks the credentials of the authors. That's just outright false. Here's what I actually said. Just like in the free will theorem, the paper's definition of free choice is entirely consistent with randomness. It says, thus, according to the Copenhagen philosophy, there are no presently known laws that govern the choices made by the agent, experimenter, observer about how the observed system is to be probed. This choice is thus, in this very specific sense, a free choice. So even if all of this is to be granted, it doesn't prove the free will that IP is arguing for, because it is indistinguishable from randomness. That point alone showed that the paper is irrelevant. Derezzed cited a paper that essentially located a point of indeterminacy in the brain that would allow the generation of multiple possible options, and that other neurons in the brain will determine which choice is taken by either allowing or not allowing a calcium ion to go through. Ander complains that this is just determinism, but ignores the fact that Derezzed mentioned that one's thoughts, identity, and intentions emerge from these neurons, so in a sense, it could be argued that the mind and its mental effort are the ones playing a role in the undetermined action. Okay, earlier Animating Rebel said it didn't matter if our thoughts and desires were determined. Well, if your thoughts and intentions are determined, you aren't responsible for them. See the problem yet? Ander claims that if neurons behave non-deterministically, then one cannot distinguish the outcome from either choice or chance. But wouldn't choice be a lot more reasonable a conclusion? Jesus Christ, another bare assertion. Alright, here's my new argument against free will. I'm just going to state that determinism is more reasonable than free will and is innocent until proven guilty. He complains that the free will theorem which IP cites only argues for indeterminism, makes no mention of idealism, and rejects the role of consciousness. The first point is irrelevant, as free will is the most reasonable conclusion one can draw from indeterminism. That doesn't follow at all. Keep in mind that indeterminism is a weaker claim than free will. Indeterminism doesn't entail free will. It could just mean indeterminism and that's it. You can't just pull free will out of your ass because indeterminism is true, and you're just asserting that free will is reasonable, again. Ander does not even bother addressing the science. Why on earth would I waste time addressing the science when I have an argument that shows Derezzed's position is logically impossible? Do you think science disproves logic? You fucking idiot. The video Ander is responding to offers a very powerful argument for free will, based on empirical evidence from several organisms who exploit indeterministic behavior. Powerful argument? Did you even fucking read that paper? Here's a quote from the Cro-Magnon Derezzed cited. Biologists need not resort to quantum mechanics to understand that deterministic behavior can never be evolutionarily stable. Evolution is a competitive business, and predictability is one thing that will make sure that a competitor will be out of business soon. I barely even had to think to notice the problems with this. Most life is incapable of prediction. He fails to realize that all life forms would have this same disadvantage. Being predictable may not put a competitor out of business if its competition is also predictable. Something can be determined and still be extremely difficult to predict. Nothing is given to support the claim that determinism would make predictability such a problem that everything would go extinct. And of course, as with all of the papers Derezzed and IP have cited as scientific evidence of free will, this paper conflates indeterminism with free will. I cannot emphasize this enough. 0 of the scientific papers cited as evidence for free will actually provide anything more than claims that certain things are indeterministic, and even those claims are disputable. It's still up for debate as to whether quantum mechanics is indeterministic. This paper is unique, however, in that it at least tries to deal with the standard argument against free will. However, it makes the same ridiculous mistake Derezzed made in assuming that simply having a mixture of both random and determined events provides an escape from the standard argument. I have a video explaining in detail why this doesn't work, but here I would just like to point out that this objection is a huge misunderstanding of the standard argument. It is as though people raising this objection think that the standard argument says that either everything is random or everything is determined. It doesn't. Derezzed has also pointed out that there is evidence for neurons behaving indeterministically in the brain as well. So fucking what?